Hello and welcome to the Klassiki podcast. I'm your host, Sam Goff. Klassiki is your window into the world of Eastern European film. Subscribers gain access to our library of classic and contemporary titles, as well as filmmaker interviews, video introductions, program notes, and more. You can sign up for a free trial today at klassiki.online. If you enjoy the show, don't forget to subscribe in your podcast app of choice, and remember you can get in touch with us at podcast@klassiki.online. Listeners may remember my conversation earlier this year with Michael Brook about the retrospective he had curated to mark the centenary of Wojciech Has, one of Poland's greatest and most misunderstood directors. Well, here at Klassiki, we're taking one last opportunity to honour Has's 100th anniversary year. Right now, until Christmas Day, subscribers can enjoy a restored version of his mind-bending masterpiece, the Saragossa Manuscript. Adapted from one of the founding classics of Polish literature and centred on the adventures of a Napoleonic officer in the haunted mountains of Spain, the film presents a surreal odyssey across time and space that nests stories within stories within stories to baffling and hypnotic effect. We're really excited to have the chance to present this film, and we figured that it could do with a little unpacking. So I invited old friend of the show, film writer and historian Ian Christie, to join me in deciphering the Saragossa Manuscript. From the source novel to the film's daring formal tricks, its place in 60s counterculture, its long critical re-evaluation, and its profound influence on everyone from Luis Buñuel to David Lynch. Check out the links in the show description to watch the Saragossa Manuscript before Christmas Day on Klassiki. You'll also find links there to our earlier podcast episode about Has's career and an essay by the film historian Dan Bird to provide some extra context. Ian Christie, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
It's always a pleasure to have you, and there's no one I'd rather be deciphering this particular manuscript with. So I was wondering how to start this conversation off, and I think if you sit down to just describe the film, then you're already facing a dilemma, because if you try and get into the plot, or plots, I should say, in the plural, then you're going to be there all day, and I'm not even sure it really helps a first-time viewer to have the plot or plots described to them. So maybe we can give a very broad skeletal outline of some of the main kind of figures and settings and symbols in the film of the Saragossa Manuscript to start us off. So having said that, I will now hand you that poison chalice and watch you drink from it.
Yeah, there are a few poison chalices in the film as well.
Well, yes, there is literally a poison. Having said that, I just realised there is literally a poison chalice. Yeah.
No, it's the... the film was a legend in its own lifetime, right from the 1960s. And at the time when the film came out, we first saw it, I first saw it in the mid-1960s at an art house cinema in London. And indeed, that's where Martin Scorsese apparently saw it too, as a young filmmaker. When it came out, it was a legend because people said, you'll never believe it. It's this extraordinarily long film with a plot so complicated that you can't possibly summarize it. None of us knew anything about its origins or the novel that it was based on. And when finally we got to see the novel, finally translated into English only in, 1995, it turns out that the novel begins exactly like the film.
It's a very faithful adaptation, structurally at least, isn't it?
It's very faithful. It's about an army officer who is fighting in Napoleonic Wars, and he rushes into a broken down house. He sees a big book in front of him. He opens it. He starts reading. And that's the beginning of it all, because he gets so attached to this manuscript that another officer joins him and they start reading it. And we are plunged into this network of fabulation, story after story after story after story. So there's no point in trying to summarize it. I think what critics originally said about it, back in the 60s was it's a huge shaggy dog story. But I think that completely misses the point. Yes, it has the kind of shape of a shaggy dog story because none of the stories seem to lead anywhere. But actually, it's a sort of more like a Chinese box structure, a story within a story within a story within a story. And I think that they do add up to a lot more than just the content of the stories, entertaining though they are.
Yeah, there's well, the film is kind of helpfully divided into two parts because of its length. It's a little over 3 hours long, and those two parts are kind of distinct, which I think does help to wrap your head around it. So yeah, like you just say, the nominal protagonist, I guess, although he kind of disappears from the screen for much of the second part of the film, is the person who has written the manuscript that is being read in the tavern by the two Napoleonic officers. And this guy is called Alphonse van Voorden, played by the great, speaking of Cebulski, contractually obliged to describe him as the James Dean of Poland, although he's looking a little less James Dean-like in this one.
It's a bit podgier, isn't he?
Yeah,
Yes.
yes. Well, James Dean never had the chance, obviously,
Oh.
to fill out in that manner. So Alphonse van Voorden, a captain in the Wallonian Guard, is attempting to cross this mountain range, the Sierra Morena, from northern Spain to Madrid. And basically, the first half of the film establishes a set of recurring characters that Van Voorden encounters as he is waylaid in this series of psychic, mystical, maybe supernatural diversions and transgressions, which largely center around this haunted inn called the Venta Quemada. And like I said, we don't really need to get into what happens, but there are the first half of the film at least has these kind of recurring sights and these recurring kind of narrative tricks. For instance, Van Voorden will drink from a skull-shaped chalice and then fall asleep and wake up next to a gallows, and then we'll kind of repeat a series of events again. So there are these loops, if you like, and these recurring characters. There's these two vaguely incestuous Orientalist fantasy sisters, the Gomeles sisters, who are potentially trying to seduce Van Voorden. There are two bandit brothers, the Zotto brothers, who at certain points are hanging dead from the gallows and at certain points are very much alive and taking part in events. There is a madman called Pacheco. There is a Kabbalist, and there is a kind of skeptical scientist or mathematician. And there is also the Spanish Inquisition. And these are this is basically the dramatis personae, certainly of the first half of the film. Have I missed anything important there?
No. But I think I'm going to quote you back to yourself.
Yes, I know I've already.
You've done a very able job, but I'm not sure that that's really the pleasure and sort of the sheer enjoyment of the film, because I think what happens in the film is that you get a sort of vertigo of falling through a series of stories.
That's
And
a good way of putting it.
at one point, you realize that you're watching, of course, in the film, you're watching a story that is inside a story, inside a story, inside a story to the power of 5. That's the maximum. And of course, that is part of the point of both the novel and of the film, that it's a sort of, you could say it's a parody of a Gothic novel. And one of the ways of understanding, where Potocki, who wrote the original novel, what he was trying to do is that he was writing a kind of Polish version of a Gothic novel, the kind of thing that, Anne Radcliffe and people like that were producing in the 18th century. Except that, and maybe this is another interesting thing which I don't think people were aware of when the film first burst into the world, Potocki is now regarded as a founding figure of Polish literature, but of course he didn't write in Polish. He wrote in French. So Polish was not a literary language, back in the day when he was writing. He was writing it basically at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. His dates more or less match the dates of Napoleon. He died by suicide in 1815. He had a very strange rackety career. There are contradictory stories about every single aspect of his career. He did live for a time in what could be described as Poland, but
Poland didn't exist at the time, of course.
Which Poland, of course, didn't exist. But he moved around a lot across Europe. He had his education in Switzerland. He was obviously very versatile. He had many careers. And this really is pretty much the only thing he wrote. He seems to have spent about 15 years writing it intermittently. So speculation about what he was trying to do, of course, is rife. But I think you can see some of the influences. It's a Gothic novel. It's a novel in which strange, sudden, mysterious, supernatural things happen, right? So that's one way of seeing it. And it's the most perfect film of a Gothic novel. I mean, if you imagine trying to make a film of, Otranto or one of these classic Gothic novels that nobody bothers to read these days, it would be very dull.
Well, I think Roger Corman managed to crank
Yes,
out a few quite undull versions of.
Corman perhaps came closest of anyone by taking a kind of head-on, let's embrace the horror and the mystery. But
helps if you've got Vincent Price, of course.
It probably does, yes. And in fact, of course, that's the other interesting thing. There's an amazing cast of Polish actors, none of whom were well known at the time, except Cebulski, of course, who was well known because of his starring part in the Vida films. But they're wonderfully varied and exotic. But I think there's another side to it, which is it's an imaginary Spain. I mean, the setting is Spain, but what Potocki in the novel and what Haas in the film tried to do was to create this sort of phantasmagoric Spain. And it's a Spain which has got the imprint of the Moorish period, the period when Spain was actually ruled by the Moors. And I think that's a really interesting aspect of it, because one whole dimension of the novel and of the film is this sort of fantasy of Moorish Spain, which of course is very popular in a sort of touristic way today. What we've got to remember is that it's a Polish film made in the early 1960s, released in 65, based on a novel, came to light in the early 19th century, about an imagined Spain. So we're already 3 steps away from any kind of reality.
Yeah. I think what you're saying there about the imagined Spain is really important, because a big part of the film is what's the word, kind of melange of different spiritual and supernatural influences and figures. Like you say, there is this harking back to Moorish Spain and the figures of these 2 princesses, the Gomeles sisters, and there's also a sheikh who appears, and there's quite a lot of Orientalist fantasy in the costuming and the architecture and so on. But then there's also the Spanish Inquisition. There's a Kabbalist, mystical Jewish figure, and there is also this basically kind of ghost supernatural story. And there's also the Romani troupe, who basically take over the second half of the film. A lot of the nesting of stories happens in the second half, when this Romani leader, Avadoro, starts recounting his youth, and it's within that recantation that we start to fall into the real rabbit holes of narrative.
Don't be tempted to start.
I won't. I'm
very important
stuff there. But just to say that it's a multi. I guess these days we'd say multicultural, which seems slightly
yes,
weird
it
way
is.
to put it.
But it speaks of the fascination of the exotic. And again, we've got to keep these 2 time periods in our mind. It's the fascination of the exotic at the time that Potocki was writing, when that was all very much in the air. But it's also, of course, try and think of this as a subject for a film being made in early 1960s Poland. I mean, this is a time when Polish cinema is turning away from, well, not turning away, going beyond its original post-war premise, which is telling the story of how Poland emancipated itself from Nazi invasion and became part of the socialist bloc. Yeah. There are filmmakers who are trying to break free of that narrative, which Andrzej Wajda had told so well in his trilogy, and they're going in different directions. This is another direction, but what's interesting about this is that it's not, adapting a foreign fantasy. It's actually the founding work of Polish literature, except being typically Polish, of course. It's not written in Polish. Potocki didn't live in Poland except for a short part of his life. And so it's typically ironic, paradoxical, And I think when I first saw the film and became fascinated by it, I was thinking Polish surrealism,
Right.
something which we had become aware of, particularly in the 1960s. There were lots of Polish emigres who had mostly fled to Paris, and there was a thriving sense of,
People
you
like
know,
Borovchik, I'm guessing you're...
but I'm thinking Borovchik, the animator, of course, who ended up in Paris making highly erotic films.
Hmm.
And it was easy to see that the sort of eroticism that runs through Saragossa manuscript, has a sort of kinship with what Borovchik was doing in Paris, and it was being labeled high class porn when he did it in Paris. I think shall we say, the erotic aspects of Saragossa manuscript did cause a lot of disquiet for the Polish film authorities. This is not the kind of thing that good socialist filmmakers are supposed to be doing. But the get out clause, the excuse was, of course, that, hey, it's a Polish classic. It's all there in the novel.
Well, I mean, that
So,
was a classic technique, right? To help sidestep censorship was to just
yeah,
adapt venerable literary works that may
exactly.
happen to have contained a lot of problematic and erotic material in them. But
Yeah. And,
what can you do?
it was a good, Haas was a very interesting filmmaker. He was a highly visual filmmaker, very well schooled in the history of Polish fine art and Polish modernism. And so he knew what he was doing. And of course, his other great film, The Hourglass Sanatorium, is based on Street of Crocodile. Well, it's based on Bruno Schulz's writing. So we know that he's in the surrealist camp. But I think it's also, and this fascinated me when I came to write about the film and really think about it. Think about when the film arrived on screens in the West outside of Poland. It was seen in a sidebar of Cannes in, I think, 65. It wasn't in the main competition. It had been turned down as being incomprehensible. The president of the festival hated it, and they put it in a very minor category. And the film did not do really well at film festivals, but it developed an underground reputation, and it was taken up by literally underground filmmakers and new wave filmmakers all over the world who said, "Hey, have you heard about this? This is the Polish film that you didn't expect." What's also striking, I think, and worth reminding people of, is that it arrived at just the moment when people were starting to read Borges.
Hmm.
Borges, great Argentinian essayist and writer, Borges was beginning to be translated and become known in English language countries and in France. And almost every review of the film mentions Borges.
Yeah.
If the reviewer has actually read Borges and said, well, it's just like Borges, The Garden of the Forking Paths or something like that. So there's a sense in which the film reaches a Western audience just at the moment when there's a new kind of context of reception. People are saying, yes, it's like Rob Grillet. It's like Last Year at Marienbad. It's like Borges. So they're fitting the film into all these different frameworks, of understanding and saying, yes, it's the Polish contribution to the new novel, to the kind of thing that
Right.
Borges is doing. And that made it very exciting. If you had your paperback of Borges fictions and you'd been to see the Saragossa manuscript, boy, you were absolutely ahead of the game.
So there's a really interesting thread there, which is a little brain scrambling in keeping with the film, which is that it seems to emerge kind of oven ready into this. I guess we're describing a kind of nascent postmodernist fiction and filmmaking, whilst also reaching back quite faithfully, as we said, to this Napoleonic era and the foundation of Polish literature, beginning of the 19th century. And when I was watching it, I had it in my head. When I was rewatching it the other day, I had it in my head, this idea: it's a surrealist film. And as I was watching it, I was thinking, what does that really mean? It's a very late 18th century, early 19th century story. As we've said, it reminds me of Tristram Shandy, Lawrence Stern. It reminds me of lots of centuries old books and tales, as much as it reminds me of 60s counterculture and kind of acid dropping mind exploration and so on. So I'm not quite sure what my question is there, but you see what I mean?
Yeah,
It
exactly.
arrives in the 60s
Yep. And it
seemingly fully
becomes part
formed,
of
but it's
60s
actually
counterculture. Yeah. Yeah.
an artifact of a much, much older kind of narrative
It
tradition.
is. And it's a very faithful um, realization of the novel. I mean, that's what's so interesting. You can peel away the layer. We ought to throw in one other thing, by the way, just to thicken the mixture. It was taken up in America, and it was seen at the San Francisco Film Festival, and that's where its American reputation really took off. And the unlikely savior, ultimately, of the film was Jerry Garcia, he of The Grateful Dead,
Right, yeah.
his favorite film, and he left money in his will for the restoration of the film. And in fact, one of the first restorations of the film was undertaken through the Pacific Film Archive. Edith Kramer of the Pacific Film Archive, based in San Francisco, was a major figure in trying to get the film seen at something like its original length. Because we should also say that
Yeah, it was exported a kind of hour
yeah,
shorter, right, than its.
there are at least three versions of it. Absolutely, at the least. I went to see the director's cut, so called, at the Bologna Festival this year, and it was a very sobering experience. I mean, I guess I had the same reaction as you were just reporting. It's a real straight, if we can call it straight, adaptation of a Gothic novel done with wonderful sort of humor, but also dead straight. Everything that you sort of read about in the novel is realized on screen in all its kind of improbable exoticism.
Yeah, it's not it doesn't have what I would call the surrealist dream logic of kind of slippages between events. All the events that unfold,
Yeah,
any individual scene could just be a kind of costume drama.
exactly.
It's the way that they're arranged in this endlessly recursive pattern that makes it
Yeah.
quote unquote
And
surrealist.
there was a big debate in France, where again the film acquired a lot of its reputation. There was a big debate in France in the mid 60s between the two great French journals, Positif and Cahiers du Cinéma, because
Well, they could
Positif,
start a fight in an empty room, couldn't they?
they could, but so there's a kind of debate going on around the film, but not talking about the film as such, because of course what everybody found very difficult to do, because the novel was available in French translation in a shortened version at that time, but nobody in the English speaking world had ever read it. So we were completely free of any association with the novel, and nor did we know anything about Potocki, or indeed very much about Haas, because Haas was not one of the well-known figures like André Weider,
Yeah.
Munch.
I guess this was the film, right, that really made his international
It did,
reputation.
exactly. And people realized that they had to kind of dig deeper and understand that there were many different layers going on inside Polish cinema, not just the emigres, the refugees who had fled communist Poland, but also the people who had stayed and were working within a deeply Polish tradition. And so what we're seeing in Saragossa Manuscript is, yes, it's absolutely exceptional, but it's also a sort of something bubbling to the surface all the way from Russia, because the other great film, of course, that got seen and often coupled with it, even in double bills, was Parajanov's Shadows of Our Forgotten
Of
Ancestors,
course, same year, 1965.
an equally baffling film. nobody, nobody could really follow the story of Shadows of Our Forgotten Ancestors originally, but these films were often shown together as examples of the weird and the wonderful, and they were very popular amongst audiences that had no, previous interest in communist cinema, because there was something completely exotic and incomprehensible.
And they're both looking back to this kind of earlier 19th century literature.
Yes, exactly.
Actually, let's just pause for a second on Jan Potocki, because we have mentioned him quite a lot already, but it is worth, just just thinking about the figure, and this is where you'll be able to step in more than me, because I mean, with Potocki, there are a lot of quite kind of sensationalist headlines about his life. He committed suicide because he was afraid he was a werewolf, for instance. Things of that
That's one
nature.
version.
Um,
He with a silver bullet. Yes, exactly.
Yes. Well, you'd have to, obviously, wouldn't you, to be sure. But I mean, like you've already described this kind of transient figure, this itinerant is the word I'm looking for.
I think itinerant and a
Figure.
sort of diasporic figure. He's moving around constantly, and he's got no settled profession. He's got no settled place of residence. He was
He was a
actually
military officer. Is that's
he was
yeah.
twice, or at least on different sides. And his political and national allegiances, whatever they might be considered to be, were very, shifting, doubtful. He actually was educated in Switzerland, in Lausanne, that was his kind of starting point. But he moves around a lot. He's a Polish nobleman. He has many different professions and activities, and in a way, he's also, I suppose, we could say, a typical man of his time, because he's kind of interested in science. He's interested in religion. He's interested in mysticism.
I was going to say,
And
very interested in the occult.
And the occult, exactly. He's living in the Napoleonic period, which is a very contradictory period, when you could find yourself suddenly on the wrong side, because, what does Napoleon stand for? On the one hand, he's a liberator. On the other hand, he's a conqueror.
Mm.
And so it's a genuinely confusing time. And you can't pin Potocki down, because he's so much a man of his time, with no fixed abode, no fixed profession. Why does he start to write a novel? There's no answer to that, but he does. He spends, it's thought, the best part of 15 years piecing this together, writing it, in relays. But it's got a very clear ground plan. That's the interesting thing. It's not a random assembly. You mentioned Tristram Shandy. It's as precise as Tristram Shandy is in its extraordinary structure. So somehow he's creating one of the kind of unique masterpieces of the period, which, of course, doesn't get recognized, doesn't even get properly published until long after his death.
I was going to say, the complete version wasn't published for, kind of 4 or 5 decades after his death. Is that right?
Yeah, and there's a lot of textual confusion about what is the final version.
Sure, I imagine, yeah.
Of course, and that's a very French subject, because he wrote in French, and so there's a mountain of French scholarship. A friend of mine, Ian McLean, who is a French scholar, as it were, did the first English translation in 1995. And I remember taking part in a number of seminars in which we said, well, finally, we have the novel. We know the film, but we have the novel now. And we can see, to our astonishment, how well the film matches the novel. I mean, that was a real discovery, because we had assumed, I think many people had assumed, that Haas and his scriptwriter had, run away with some ideas from the novel. But actually, no, they hadn't. They were being almost literal in realizing what's in the novel. And the running joke through the film, which we haven't mentioned yet, is, let me tell you a story, or that reminds me of a story.
Yeah.
And it's this magic phrase which always causes a chuckle in the audience. I tested that recently. Let me tell you a story, and the audience know we're in for another sort of slip into another exotic loop in the sequence. It's a joke, but also, of course, it's the narrative device that takes us from one scene to another scene to another scene to another scene. And of course, you begin to feel that you are, in some sense, however remote this is from the reality of Spain, you are actually doing a sort of archaeology of influences in Spain, the Spain of the 16th, 17th, 18th century.
And so also Potocki's own intellectual kind of biography.
Yes, exactly.
There's the occult, there's the mysticism of the Kabbalah, there's the kind of campaigns of the Napoleonic Wars, there's there's kind of nobility and rationality.
The framing stories and the themes that run through them are very much drawn from his experience of the era. But also, I think what's interesting, it's the Moorish occupation of Spain that gives rise to the Inquisition. It's the Moorish kind of reconquest of Spain that gives rise to the ferocity of the Inquisition. So that kind of face-off between the Moorish tradition in Spain and the new tyranny of Spain, that is the real kind of backdrop, I think, to the novel and indeed to the film.
Yeah, the Inquisition are the baddies, basically. I mean, in as much as there's an antagonist, it's
Yeah, they
the
are.
Inquisition. They torture our hero at one point with a strange torture helmet device. Wikipedia also tells me, just incidentally, that Potocki was the first person in Poland to fly in a hot air balloon. So there you go.
Yes, that's another of his many, many strange claims to fame. Yes. I mean, you really couldn't make him up. And of course, those of us who were, enthused by the idea of Polish surrealism being something completely authentic and indigenous, as it were, used to delight in these discoveries about Potocki, because then almost anything that you want to attach to him, I mean, you mentioned him thinking he might be a werewolf. There's a whole bunch of stories about how he met his end. Certainly it was suicide, that's true. But he'd done so many bizarre and wonderful and weird things along the way that he could be a figure from his own fiction.
Right, yeah.
And that sort of life and work, mirroring, I think is very, very intriguing. And of course, seemed to many of us looking at it from the outside, very typically Polish. If you think about the great masters of, Polish cinema, Andrzej Munch, for instance, and the deep, deep layers of irony that reside inside some of the great classics of Polish cinema. This also has a deeply ironic undertext.
Now, we talked quite a lot already about the reception of the film and how it shifted over time as people. You've talked about how it landed in the 60s and then how it seemed to fit into trends then, and how over time as Haas and Potocki became better known, the reputation then maybe shifted again. And one aspect of the kind of legend of the film, if you like, is this kind of cult influence it's said to have held over a lot of important figures. There's the story about Jerry Garcia that you've already mentioned. There's the hold it had over Luis Buñuel. There's the kind of long, torturous story of its eventual restoration by Martin Scorsese and Francis Ford Coppola. There's its kind of hold over people like David Lynch. So I guess maybe we should also talk about that, right? The afterlife aspect of the film, because it does seem to have, like all great cult objects, it has this genealogy running through these famous figures that people like to unravel.
I think it was a very productive film, and its kind of underground status, which is definitely the status it had at the end of the 60s, really contributed to that. It was like a secret that was shared amongst people who felt they were part of, an underground. Dave Curtis, who used to run the Arts Lab in London, told me that it was an absolute staple at the Arts Lab. Every time they needed to raise some money, show the Saragossa manuscript, and you were sure of a full house. And that's really quite significant, because it was also doing the same in New York. The beginning of the midnight movie scene in New York,
right? Yeah,
at the Elgin cinema. The late night movies that hipsters in New York were going to. They were showing Jodorowsky, El Topo, and the new film they took up was the Saragossa manuscript. And that, I think, is really very important, because George Romero, for instance, was a fan.
Right.
The man would go on to revitalize horror movies. So it was very productive. Sally Potter, one of our own great filmmakers, Sally Potter is on record as saying that she was excited and stimulated by seeing Saragossa manuscript and Last Year at Marienbad. And so she might not have made her breakthrough into feature-length films without, the influence of those. She was a dancer at that time and a musician, but it was these films that sparked her interest. Peter Greenaway, I think, is another good example of somebody who's undoubtedly inspired by it, for his kind of new narrative structures. And you mentioned Buñuel. I mean, Buñuel, of course, is on record as saying, it's the only film he ever saw 3 times. He thought it was great. But actually, think about it. Buñuel's later development, the late period Buñuel, those stories that crash into each other, they're Chinese box structures. And I do think that there's a real influence, and Buñuel doesn't talk about this obviously, but I think there's a real influence of what Haas and Potocki had done in his own later work. So I think we can trace a very productive sort of genealogy of influence from the Saragossa manuscript. It's a bit surprising when you suddenly go up against the film itself, because it's got this very exotic, name-laden afterlife, as you say. But hey, it's a film in its own right, and now we actually have the director's cut of the film, so we can see what the original was like.
Yeah, I hope that's something that's come across while we've been talking, that it had this afterlife, but it's only maybe recently that we really properly. This is always the way with film history. It takes a long time for the proper contextualization to come to the fore. So it was very much a film of its time. It was a film of the kind of mid-60s in Poland, where there were a lot of these historical period epics being made. It was a film, like we've said, it's a very faithful adaptation of this classic Polish novel. It just so happens to slot into this international current, this kind of acid-drenched countercultural current, and then get taken off, like all great films do, in its own directions. I mean, Buñuel had he even bought the distribution rights in Mexico, didn't he? I mean, he really was committed to it.
He apparently he suggested to his producer that they should try to swap his own Simon of the Desert, a rather wonderful film, too, for it. That would be a bit ironic, since Simon of the Desert is a very short film and Saragossa Manuscript is a very long film.
Yeah, you could watch it 4 times, I think, in the time it takes you to watch the Saragossa Manuscript.
Exactly. But Buñuel was undoubtedly really taken by it, and he doesn't really praise many films in his memoir, but he does praise it, and of course you can see immediately what the attraction would be. But you can list a lot of people who are on record as saying that it was influential. Kenneth Anger, for instance. Kenneth Anger recut one of his films after seeing Saragossa Manuscript, and I think when he added Janacek and so forth to one of his films, he was clearly being influenced by Saragossa Manuscript. Incidentally, we haven't mentioned the music. And I think
by Krzysztof Penderecki, of course.
Great music is hugely important, because this is not a film that has a kind of a cod 18th century score, which it could have had. Let's say it could have had a sort of reworking of Handel or something like that. But no, it has a really aggressively modernist score by Penderecki, a part electronic score. And apparently that was part of what appealed to Jerry Garcia when he saw the film out in California. He loved the music. And it's a reminder that during this period, during the 1960s, avant-garde composers who were interested in electronics, writing 12-tone music and things like that, one of the few places they could do this and get paid for it was in writing for film. It happened in lots of different cultures. Here in Britain. All the avant-garde composers wrote scores for horror movies. Yeah. But Penderecki's score would probably have been the first time that most people would have heard his music through watching the film. So,
of course, there's people, Alfred Schnittke in the Soviet Union, of course.
Precisely. Schnittke's music reached Western audiences when the films that he'd scored didn't get banned. But I remember several Russian Soviet era filmmakers telling me how proud they were of working with Schnittke. But the only way you could hear Schnittke before he was taken up by orchestras was through his film soundtracks.
And of course, the Penderecki score also reflects what we've been saying about this strange recursive structure and afterlife of the film, because, like you say, there are these minimalist, semi-electronic sections, but he does also compose quote-unquote fake 18th century music for some of the recollections and some of the stories within stories. So he does act, there is that historical, ironic historical layering, if you like, in the soundscape of the film as well.
I think ironic is the right way to describe it, because he's quoting, if you like, 18th century music in a context which is clearly a modernist context. And I think that's what appealed to us very much in the 1960s. I mean, again, just locate it back to the first concept of reception. We didn't know how much really was bubbling underneath the surface in Poland at this time in the art scene, the cultural scene. And I think this was a very welcome sign that the spirit of innovation, I mean, it comes out of Krakow and the whole kind of culture of Krakow, bubbling with modernist tendencies, which are being held in check. But cinema is one of the places where you can express these countercultural impulses. And I think Haas did it, not only in this, but also in the Hourglass Sanatorium. These are out-and-out modernist works produced by a state-controlled film industry, much to its embarrassment. They were planning that the film should be a Christmas release, apparently, originally. And then the authorities took one look at it, or maybe several looks at it, and said, oh, no, this is not going to be released for Christmas. So they cut it and released it in the February rather than putting it out for Christmas, which is what the original plan had been. They realized they had much more on their plate than they had expected.
I'm just trying to get my head around the idea of the Saragossa Manuscript as a Christmas film.
Something to take the kids to, yes.
Well, in its kind of a quasi-incestuous seduction story, I guess it's a family movie.
Yes. I think that probably was how Haas sold the idea to the authorities, because there was a lot of very clever, fancy footwork going on in the cultural community who knew how to play the game. I remember talking to a number of Polish filmmakers from the period, to Vida, for instance, that you knew that you were playing footsie with the censors, because the censors were very much in place. But here Haas had the perfect cover story, because it really was a Polish classic. I don't know what they imagined they would get, probably, a kind of jolly costume film with all the rude bits cut out. But as we know, the rude bits are present, but very elegantly present. And I think, again, let's remember that this is a period when the full scale of production resources were available to Polish filmmakers, as indeed they were to Soviet era Russian filmmakers. You could produce a huge period spectacle, if you wanted to, if you could justify it to the authorities. And this is one that, as it were, did get justified, did get made. And even though it was cut and was originally seen in a cut form, now we can see it in the director's cut. Very fashionable concept.
Well, I'm very glad that it does exist and that we're able to share it on klassiki. I think if ever there was a film, Ian, where you could accidentally talk about it for probably the length of the film itself, another couple of hours, it's the Saragossa Manuscript. But we must exercise some self-control, some self-censorship, and I think we'll knock it on the head there for today. But Ian Christie, as always, great pleasure to talk to you in this instance about Wojciech Haas's The Saragossa Manuscript. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Sam. Great pleasure.